So thanks for coming out. Hope you're having a good weekend. My name is Dave Moore. I'm a developer at NPR, a very, very back-end developer. And for almost 4 years, I worked on a large Drupal 7-based platform at NPR called Core Publisher. It now serves about 150-ish public media entities. So chances are your local public radio station is using it in one form or another. And today, however, we're not going to talk about the back end. We're going to talk about the front end, Drupal theming. But first, fair warning. As I just said, I'm a back-end developer. It says I'm not a full-time themer. I'm not even really a part-time themer anymore these days. Every year I infiltrate this conference and get dressed up in a loud shirt and fresh kicks, try to pass myself off as a front-end guy. The beard usually gives it away that I'm a back-end guy. I am absolutely crazy about clean and consistent code. This is what gets me up in the morning, believe it or not. And so we're going to apply some of those thoughts that we usually think about in terms of modules, and I'm going to talk about it in terms of themes. Unfortunately, you can leave now if you're hoping for some Drupal 8 hotness. I have none of that. I wish I did, but I'm still very new to a lot of the Drupal 8 stuff. Instead, this is you're probably getting a whole lot of sugary bits this weekend about Twig and Drupal 8 and design and whatnot. This is the cold water. This is the bitter medicine of how to write good themes. I apologize ahead of time. There's one image that isn't a screenshot of code. And there will be code. I put this in the intermediate level, which I think is about right. It means, let's just actually, before we go any further, show of hands. Who has written Drupal themes or worked on Drupal themes? Who's just sort of starting out? Anyone who does more back-end stuff? Any developers, really? Primary developers? OK, that's a good mix. So this probably should be fairly relevant to most of you then, hopefully. Before we get to the numbered list, this is probably the biggest takeaway. I don't want to step on any toes here, so I'm going to be careful. What do I mean by this? It means if you're writing a theme as opposed to a module, you probably are dealing with a lot fewer pieces of core, right? You don't need to know every single hook. And in fact, a lot of hooks won't work in Drupal themes. But it doesn't require any less discipline. You still have to write your hooks. You have to write your code clean. And why? Because just like developers, if you're a disciplined, mindful themer, you produce great code. People love you. Your boss loves you. The people maintaining your code, who usually is you anyway, loves you. It's just a win-win all around. So jumping right in, I said there was going to be some bitter medicine. It doesn't get any better than this. And I should say right up front, I'm in no way a security expert. So we're not going to get very deep on this. But it probably should be number one. You can make the prettiest theme in the world, but if it's insecure and it gets hacked or defaced at 2 in the morning, your boss doesn't care how pretty it was 12 hours earlier. So Drupal 7, actually, if you've looked at security and thought about security and themes, Drupal 7 theming layer has warts and all. It does a pretty good job with security. There's some things you got to think about. Twig, at least I've heard, again, I don't know too much about it. He's even better with that. But you still should have a basic understanding of security. And I'll give you a few examples in a second. And in fact, generally speaking, when you think about it, themes are probably a bigger vector for insecurity than modules. You can write a module that never prints to the screen. It might have some security holes here and there, but themes probably are a little more vulnerable. So you're going to see a lot of examples today. Many of them are taken from themes. Many of them are taken from the most popular themes. I was surprised. I did not have to dig deep to find some examples of bad code. This is a contrived example. I did not find this an actual any active theme. If you don't know why this is a bad idea, then you should read up on theming security. In a nutshell, that variable was added to the variable table by someone, probably through a config form. which means they probably had some sort of, passed some sort of test for user login and things like that. So you probably can trust them. But this still is a very bad idea for a variety of reasons, which we'll get to in a second. This, again, contrived example, is even worse. And if you don't know why it's worse, you should find out. This means anyone who can look at your site can add a query string and print something to your page. And it could be something very innocuous, or it could be some really bad JavaScript. And this is something you should also, you could probably find this online, or you can steal it from the PDF of the talks. That'll be up later. But this is a little flow chart that I keep posted up next to my desk. I always have to remind myself of it, primarily because there's some inconsistencies in the way these, I don't think anyone loves the names of these functions, but you should know at least these ones, and you should know when to use them in your themes. Everyone know about the Drupal coding standard? I'm going to get really nutty about this, I apologize. Everyone? Drupal coding standard? Ooh. Okay, there's a Drupal coding standard out there. Please follow it. Please follow it religiously. It's drupal.org/coding-standard, I think. It's very easy to find. And it applies to themes and to modules. This might be my all-time favorite tweet of all time. If you're arguing about an existing coding standard for an existing project, you are wasting your time and the time of the people who are unfortunately listening to you. I bring this up because I've had this happen in real life. People saying, oh, it's in the standard, but I like to do it this way, or it doesn't make sense. Coding standards aren't about right and wrong. They're about consistency. And a consistent theme is a maintainable theme. It's easier to get in and fix. It's easier to read because it's very predictable. That's what a coding standard is about. And especially if you're on a big team, or you're handing off code, or you're in a bigger company, they're essential. It's going to drive you crazy if you're writing your theme one way and someone right next to you on the same project is writing their theme in a completely different way. Tears will be shed. So here's some examples. That's a bad doc block. That first and foremost, that should be a, and again, these are from pretty popular. I've anonymized most of these, so I'm not pointing any fingers, but I think I missed one or two. That's a pretty popular theme, and that's a bad doc block. Should be a verb, first of all, and it's a hook, so it should be implements, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The doc blocks, by the way, those are important because when you're using tools that will go through and find comments, it'll miss that. It won't say, oh, that's a hook implementation, because it'll miss that. Missing a space there, missing indentation there, makes it harder to read, less predictable. There's a space there. Anyone know what this bottom, does that ring any bells? Did you know, deep within the coding standard, there's a rule about function names, variables, et cetera. Now, we could get into a fight about how it says should and not must, and the Drupal coding standard says should when it should say must. But if you're following a coding standard, mentally turn all the shoulds into must, right? It just makes sense. Why, if you're gonna quibble about this thing, then you're defeating the purpose of following a coding standard in the first place. Coder module. Does everyone know about coder module? Yeah? Okay. Coder module will save you a ton of time. It will make things so much easier for you. Run the coder module. I would say anytime you want to do any kind of moderate to big release, and it will save you an immense amount of time. It's a beautiful thing. You just run the module. It gives you a printout of all your coding standard problems. You fix it. You run it again. It says you're fine. Put a release on it. You're good to go. Coding standard only goes so far, and if you really want to be serious about theming and you're working on a big project, especially with multiple themers, consider extending the style guide, basically. And what do I mean? I'm talking about little idioms in your TPL files, how deep do you go with granularity on the TPLs, the file architecture, where do I know that the JavaScript file is going to be, et cetera. And I'll show you an example from NPR in a second. CSS rules, JavaScript standards and idioms, et cetera. The more you can codify that, again, the more consistent and readable and predictable and maintainable your code is going to be, especially working on bigger projects. Now here's just some boilerplate TPL. And so some examples would be, when do you indent? How far do you indent? Do you use the end if idiom? Things like that. The more you can put rules around that stuff, the easier it is going to maintain. Here's a screenshot from the directory from our NPR's big, we have a mothership theme called Pilot, and all the station themes are children of that. But whether it's a theme or module at NPR, we use the same exact rules, which are, it's CSS. I don't care if you have one 5-line CSS file, you still make a directory called CSS. That way, it goes back to, what's his name, Stephen Krug. Don't make me think. I got to look at the CSS for this module or this theme. I know exactly where it is. Images, it's images plural. JS, it's not JavaScript, it's just JS. Templates, plural, etc. Nice, clean, and again, it doesn't matter if it's one file or 20. They always go in the same place. Much more easy to debug that way. No site-wide functionality or markup in the theme. What on earth do I mean about this? When you're developing, especially when you're developing a platform, a project like we are, you come across what I call themey stuff. It kind of smells like theme stuff. Facebook OG, Twitter cards. It's usually metadata in the head. And immediately you say, oh, I'm going to put this in my theme because it's themey and it's in markup and things like that. And it's so tempting to do because it's so easy to do. You just put it in the TPL and walk away, and I'm done. But what you got to do is ask yourself this important question before you do that. If I change my theme tomorrow, would I still want that markup on my page? Yes, then it doesn't belong in the theme. And what we learned that lesson kind of sort of the hard way at NPR. The team, I want to say my team, but it's not my team anymore. The team I used to be a part of is now making this whole new responsive theme, of course. And they looked at that pilot theme that I just showed you the architecture for and realized there was a lot of stuff that when they move over to responsive, if they don't move that stuff out of the theme, it's going to be lost. And so before they could build this responsive theme, they started to take stuff out of pilot. And we came up with the idea about a year ago of, we have several junk drawers, which are custom modules that just deal with very custom specific stuff to our sites and our platforms. We created a junk drawer that is just for themey stuff. It's called Outrigger. I won't explain why. But anytime you have this little snippet, it's sort of micro functionality. It would be overkill to make a module out of it. But it's stuff I want in the markup, regardless of the theme, then I throw it in my junk drawer. And it's messy in that junk drawer, like a junk drawer, but at least you know, A, where it is, and it's easy to, well, not easy to find, but you know where it is. How about that? This is one thing we strive for. I wish, actually, in the Drupal community, there's more around this. Maybe there is, and I just haven't found it. And I mean, a Drupal theme, in a perfect world, the Drupal themer wants to focus on the front end. They want to focus on the HTML, the CSS, and the JavaScript. They need to know PHP, unfortunately, but they want a minimal amount of PHP. They want to focus on the front end, as they should. And so what do I mean by that? I mean, if you can get away with it, and you should be able to get away with it, just use a bare minimum of logic, a print statement. Don't do function calls, please. I guess there's an exception for render. After years and years, I'm still trying to figure out exactly how render works, I think. No variable assignments, why? But that's what your preprocess is for. It's crazy to do variable assignments in a TPL. And never print entire tags. I mean, that's what exiting out of PHP is all about. So you can just write the tag. Why would you print the tag? And again, did not have to look far, unfortunately, for a function call, function calls. I don't even know what this is ugly. That's crazy stuff. Variable declarations. This is ugly. Theme call. This is just, whew. Do you want to maintain that? I don't. All right, closely related, and this comes from programming, basically. If it should be a variable, make it a variable. And what on earth, you like my tautology here? What do I mean by that? This is not a popular theme. I had to look a little bit for this. But I found it out in the wild. I mean, they're called variables. That's just a URL for JavaScript. I have problems with that second JavaScript line, too. But I'm just going to focus on the fact that they're printing a URL here. They're called variables because they can vary. And if you work in the web, there's one thing you know, URLs can change, right? And they might only be printing that in one place and say, hey, I'm only printing this in one place, why make it a variable, right? And the answer is, because if that URL changes, again, and these bad things only happen at 2 o'clock in the morning, don't forget. If that variable changes, you have to make a code change. You have to go into your theme and change that URL. If it's a variable, you maybe have to change your variable. You have to do a database query, much easier, things like that. And it also opens up the possibility of configuration, right? Theme settings. You can use theme settings to set that. And now it's not even a database call. You can go into the GUI. Boom, change it to a cache clear. Your site's back up again. It doesn't have that missing JS. In programming, a magic number. A magic number in programming is something that's some kind of obscure string or number that is buried way deep in your code, that's hard-coded, and really should not be there. It should be a constant or a variable. It could be prone to change. Code reviews. Who does code reviews here? Yeah, more hands, more hands. Code reviews we didn't start doing at NPR. We started doing them too late. And by too late, I mean we didn't start doing them at the very, very, very beginning. Anything after that is too late. Code reviews, so crucial for so many reasons. You can't learn in a vacuum. You need to look at other people. If you want to learn how to be a better coder and a better themer, you've got to look at other people's code. You've got to have other people look at your code. You've got to set your pride aside for a little bit. You've got to be learning to say, OK, you know what? I don't know everything. It also helps with interpersonal skills. It makes your skin a little thicker. You get to know the people a little bit better. At NPR, and at the team I was on, the developers had a very, very good rapport. And actually, we would do code reviews up on a big screen. We'd project the code up onto a big screen, and developers would gather around. And things started to get a little pointed and funny, but we were all humble enough to say, yeah, you're right. And we could not only just be critical of the code, but we could get a little jab in there, twist the knife, and it was fun. It was actually fun. And there's a great quote. This is actually from another 10 Commandments. It's the 10 Commandments of the egoless programmer from, I think, decades ago. Jeff Atwood, if you read him a lot, he has popularized this. He always substitutes kung fu for karate, but this is like the most valuable takeaway. No one can know everything, right? There's always someone who knows more than you, and keep that in mind. And there's so many different technologies out there that you got to be ahead of. Like, I might know more about theming than the guy next to me, but he probably knows more about Git, So keep that in mind. Set your ego aside for this kind of stuff. This is a mantra you see in programming all the time, especially in Drupal, which is modular. They use modules. They use small pieces, unless you're talking about views, which is a very large piece. But keep that in mind. Keep your modules small and portable. Keep your functions small and reusable. Keep your TPLs small. A large, complicated, logistical nightmare of a TPL is going to be worse than if you break that up into TPLs that call TPLs that call TPLs into nice, manageable chunks. Same thing with functions. Who here has written the 200, 300, 400 line node preprocess? Oh, come on. I'm not. You're behind the camera. You won't show up on film, I promise. I have, and I've had to debug it, and it's horrible. It's terrible. And we'll get to a little bit more about preprocess in a couple minutes. The more you break that up into manageable, reusable functions, the better. Here's a good example of, again, an example taken from the wild. I mean, that's just messy. I'm also trying to think about this. Where's the space here, right? So it prints name, and I think maybe space is in the name, right? Because if you want to get a space between on, I mean, the function calls, the translate, I mean, that right there, that's complicated enough. Put it in another TPL. I guarantee you that's going to be reused by another TPL anyway. Keep it small. What do I mean by this? This is kind of a somewhat complicated and nuanced thing. Here's a very simple, now we're going back into the module world for a second. Bear with me, I'll explain. We're going to come back around to theming. This is a simple, very basic module I'm working on. It doesn't matter what it does. You've all seen it before. Oh, it's really hard to see that. It's in 7, so it looks even plainer than usual. 7, the theme, so it looks even plainer than usual, but you know what it looks like. You got the table. You got the faint zebra striping. You got the, what are those called? Local action, the add query. It does something. It doesn't really look like it does something, but it does something. It adds a query. The powers that be are going to see this when the module writer writes this and say, I like the functionality. I think it looks like shit, right? And so if the designer and if the developer and the themer aren't working together or aren't the same person, that developer is going to start adding CSS to the module to make the local action look more like an action, take away some of the striping, or make the contrast zebra striping more serious. And suddenly you have an interface that looks great, but looks completely different from all the other, from the add content page, from the browse content page, from all the other tables that show up in your admin site. So don't work against, so the solution here is obvious by now. The developer hands that off back to the themer and says, fix it in the theme so your action links and your zebra striping look exactly the same across the site. Similarly, so this is a piece of admin from Core Publisher. It's one of our cooler things we did. It's basically a GUI on top of the blocks table, the blocks interface, which you've ever worked with the Drupal block interface, you know needs some help as far as usability goes. Problem is, and again, we use an admin theme that is just a kissing cousins of Bartik, basically. It takes Bartik and then makes tiny little changes. So pretty simple, basic admin theme. Very easy, by the way, to edit and change. What do? We made this slick-looking GUI, and the powers that be came in, and we were already on a deadline, and I don't know why we had found time to do this, but we put these green links in. There's nothing else in our theme that's green. But we put these green links in. Even worse, we have these tabs. We have that plus tab. That's not an idiom anywhere in Drupal. And it certainly isn't going to show up elsewhere in the admin theme. We wrote our own modal. It's a whole bunch of ways to do modal windows. And then we write the modal, and it doesn't have any theming. It's thematically inconsistent with the rest of the admin theme. We're working against Drupal. We're not working with it, right? All right, number 10. This is my touchy-feely slide that I put in every talk now. Regardless of the topic. So we live in a fascinating time. It's a little scary and weird and whatnot, but I get paid to do my hobby. I don't know about you folks, but I get paid to do my hobby. My wife's a management consultant. In the extremely little free time she has, she doesn't go home and write spreadsheets and PowerPoint decks, you know? So don't take that for granted. Stay humble and curious, as we talked about in code reviews. The most important things you can say to your teammates, to your product owner, to your boss, is admit when you're wrong, admit when they're right, and admit when you don't know something, right? Like I said before, no one can know all this stuff. Better to be humble. The job will not save you. This is if you're not familiar with The Wire, Google this phrase, and you'll find a very not safe for work, I'm sure, language-wise, video. Fascinating interaction between, what's his name? Lester Freeman and McNulty. It's great to be obsessed with this job. It's your hobby. You should be obsessed with. This is awesome. The minute you get consumed by it and you don't have a life outside of it, it sucks. It stinks. So those are my words of wisdom. 25 minutes, huh? What do you say? Should we double down? You want 10 more rules? By the way, that's the image. There you go. Everything else is a screenshot of code, sorry. All right. Contribute back. This is obligatory, right? We're at a Drupal conference. This is Drupal. This is open source. A lot of times themers say, yeah, but you know what? My theme is so custom, though. It's for this site. How can I contribute it back? One thing, it's hard. It's hard because it requires discipline and thoughtfulness, but it's a little bit harder. If you have a great theme and you have all these great ideas and whatnot, create a base theme out of it first, and then put your customization in a child theme. And that way, you can kick back your parent theme, and you'll get people looking at it. You'll get eyeballs looking at it. You'll get people saying, hey, you have a coding error. Hey, your doc should look like that. Hey, I found a bug. Hey, here's an improvement. You get free work done on it, basically. Blog posts are another way. If you have just a little snippet of code in your theme and you say, this is an interesting way to do X, put it in a blog post. Issue queues, support forums, etc. Again, this is obligatory. I have to say this, but it is a great way to learn. It's a great way to earn Drupal karma. How meta is this, huh? I'm giving a presentation at a conference to tell you to do presentations at a conference. Okay, this is probably the hardest thing to explain. Create an API for your theme. This comes directly from a bunch of talks that Larry Garfield has given. And it's really powerful. It's really powerful and interesting in modules. And I thought the other day when I was making this slide, hey, there's no reason you can't do it in themes too. And what does that mean? It means when you write a hook, don't put all your business logic in the hook. Like we said before, don't have that 200-line pre-process, right? This is real-life code. Hopefully I've anonymized it. We're doing the exact same thing in two different hooks, right? You don't need to know anything special about APIs or anything like that to know that that's wrong, that you should create a function, right? And it should look like that. But there's another reason to do that. For all the good reasons it's more maintainable, it's reusable, it's easier to debug, blah, 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 blah. But also, you're creating an API, right? So hooks aren't API functions. If you have a hook submit, okay, which is more of a module example, I admit, but if you have a hook submit and you have all this business logic in it, it's impossible to test. You can't call that hook submit directly. It's just a mess. But if you take all that logic out and put it into smaller functions, it's easier to reuse, it's easier to maintain, and it's easier to test. Now, I don't think there's a lot of testing that goes around themes, but I would like to see it. And the way you get there is you make more smaller functions that are reused that create a real API, really. I mean, when any hook you write really should just be, it should be very indirect. It should just call other functions in a perfect world. Docs matter. Again, got to say this. This is some bitter medicine. Who likes writing documentation? Yes, that's the correct answer. And I'm going to take my hand down because I don't like it either. Docs matter for a lot of reasons. And there's not enough documentations and modules, and I think there's even less in themes. And I'm going to speak very broadly, but that's been my experience. This is the boilerplate from some random TPL from core. Everyone looks at this. A lot of times people just take this and copy it down to their version of block or node TPL and then never change it. This is invaluable. You know, if you've ever been in a theme and you're writing something and you say, oh, what's that variable? Do I have this variable available to me? It'd be so nice if you could just look up at the doc and actually rely on it and say, oh, that's the name of it, and that's what it does. Thanks. So yeah, docs matter. Please put documentation, and you know, it maybe doesn't have to be this exhaustive, but it would be nice. It's 2014. I hopefully don't have to say too much more about this. You know, the first Drupal conference I went to many years ago, it probably said, put all your files in CVS or try and use version control or something like this. The debate has pretty much ended if you're working in Drupal. You can use another VCS. I'm not sure why you would. Put all your files in Git. It's true for modules. It should be true for themes. If you're not using Git, it's incredible how much time and effort and ease it will add or save in your life. It's just a great thing. All right, this is no CSS in a module. In a perfect world, which I obviously live in, you would never have CSS in a module. And what do I mean by that? I'm gonna, don't worry. I'm gonna hedge my bet there. What it means, though, is if you start writing a module and you start putting CSS in it, it is a bit of a slippery slope, and it should give you pause to think, because especially if you're using it to, like I said before in that example with the table and the local action, if you're using it, especially if you're using it to tweak things that should be tweaked in the theme, should be a little bit of a red flag. I know it doesn't always work that way, but definitely think twice. I went back and looked at some old code from NPR and just looking at CSS files and modules, and again, it's just one of those things where, oh, there's already a CSS file, I want to do this thing. Yeah, it's going to take 5 lines in the theme, and I'm going to have to call up the themer, and I'm going to have to, look at it across every implementation of the theme, and boy, I can just throw it in that module and just focus on that. And my boss, who's looking just at that feature, is going to say, that's exactly the way I want it. But it creates technical debt, which is another slide. But it starts from there, and once there's the CSS file in that module, people see that and go, all right, I don't even have to change directories. I can make that bright red and underlined from here. So just a warning sign. Microcopy is another thing that I get obsessed about. It's not as relevant in themes as it is in modules, but I probably should have, I ran out of time, but I should have grabbed some of my favorite bad examples of microcopy, where it's basically just this much better than reading insert description here, basically. It's one step above the boilerplate. Like the developer went back and said, okay, I'm going to put a description here, but I'm going to put about 5 minutes, because you know what? When the designer and when the project owner, when they look at it, they'll notice it and make it better. And they never do. So microcopy does matter. There's not a whole lot of places where you're going to see microcopy. Theme settings is one where you'd see it in a theme. Probably a few other places. But if you've gotten all the way to rule number 16, if you've been fastidious about 1 through 15, in for a dime, in for a dollar. Think about your microcopy. Look at it on the screen. Have another set of eyes on that and to look at it and say, hey, yeah, you're right. That doesn't make any sense. Or what about in this situation, et cetera, et cetera. Be comprehensive. So this probably should be in the canonical top 10. But this is a place where you see themes fall down, or beginning themers do a good job on the theme but then miss this part. And what do I mean by that is there are awful lots of nooks and crannies, especially on the admin side if you're developing an admin theme. And by the way, if you're developing a theme, you should take into account the fact that someone might want to use this on the admin side, right? So it should be, look, at least unbroken, as we say, not broken on the admin side. There's lots and nooks and crannies and Drupal boilerplate CSS and little, warning messages, et cetera, all throughout Drupal, which you can use the default as long as it looks okay within your theme. But you really should take the time and say, okay, I'm going to look at that in my theme, and it looks okay. Or I'm going to look at that in my theme, it looks okay, but I want to make it better. I'm going to write the CSS to make it better. Style guide, which is a module. It's a module that it's much like Coder. It's not a module that does anything on your site, but it helps you develop and helps you write better code. This is an amazing little module where you put it on your site, and then it'll show you every single little tiny widget, every single warning message, every single bold, italics, all this stuff, and it says, this is what this looks like in the wild without any kind of CSS above it. Is that okay? If your user stumbles upon this, are they gonna be okay with that? it's a great way to make sure you cover all the bases and you don't have your boss coming up to you on some edge case saying, I thought you said the theme was done, you know? Well, when this warning message pops up or, you know, it just looks terrible. This is kind of related, and again, we're going back over to the module side, but whenever you are doing some sort of theming or markup that has to be in the module, look at it in other themes, right? You might say, hey, that looks okay, because you just happen to be using a theme in which it looks okay. But put it in Garland. I use Garland as, that's what the front-end guy I work with, he always says Garland uses sort of the most sort of basic. Now you have Stark, right, which is even more barren. But you know, look at it in other themes, especially core themes. See what it looks like. All right. Technical debt. Who here has heard this phrase before? Right? So that's good. I like that. It was probably a lot less, you know, just even 2 or 3 years ago. I'm going to sound like a technical debt, also a thing I'm obsessed with. Technical debt, and it's a very interesting UX, nuanced, complicated topic. But really, in a nutshell, technical debt is, now, I'm going to gloss over. Technical debt is bad code that works now, right? If you've never been on a project that didn't have technical debt, I don't believe you. Every project has technical debt, right? And this is very intertwined with a lot of earlier slides, like, hey, this needs to be out now. Let's put this in the TPL. Now, like I said, technical debt always happens. The important thing is document it, minimize it, fix it as soon as possible, right? Technical debt, there's been a lot of interesting essays. I love the theory about broken window code, which I've seen up front in many situations. And it's based on the sociological or anthropological theory about a broken window. If you have an abandoned lot or an abandoned car or something, you break one window, and then the dominoes start falling, right? Then the other windows get broken, et cetera, you know, crime moves in, et cetera. It's the same thing with code. If you have a junior developer and he sees a terrible pattern, a terrible shortcut where you have a function call and a TPL, or you're doing something lazy, he or she's going to say, hey, that must be an acceptable design pattern because it's in our, it's in our code, and our code is on a live server, so I'm going to do that too. And then the next person does it, next person does it, next person does it. And you can see why it's called technical debt, compounding, right? It's like compounding interest. And suddenly you have a rat's nest, and that's no fun. This is a really, really, really niche kind of thing. I wanted an even 20, so I had to think of some. I had to think of some small ones here. Does everyone? Shortcodes used to be a really big thing. Does anyone? Do people still use shortcodes here? PHP shortcodes? We're not going to have this debate. Oh, I was ready for this. All right. So there's actually PHP shortcodes are when you don't have the PHP there. You just use question mark. So bracket, question mark, bracket, question mark. You don't have to have the PHP there. Don't do that. There's also a variation of a debate about whether or not this counts as a shortcode. You used to see this all the time in Drupal themes. That is shorthand for bracket, question mark, PHP, print, foo, okay? This is how lazy we can be, folks. I don't want to type 4 more characters. Actually, it's whatever, 5 or 6 more characters. I don't want to do that. So I actually got into this long debate with, this is really kind of academic if no one's using them, but I still want to have this. So this is what the coding standard says about it, da, 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 da. But you notice it doesn't talk about bracket, question mark, equals. So if you're really interested in this, you can go to this Stack Exchange, and they do a back and forth. The problem with shortcode, and even with the bracket, question mark, equals, is there is a parameter in PHP, in your PHP ini, that can say no shortcodes. And I don't think you get a fatal error, but you do.
In 5.4.
Yes!
Equals still works, even if short codes are turned off.
Yes, yes, I was hoping someone was going to say that. And also in 5.4, these are the PHP ini setting for both of these is conflated. So if it's on, they'll both, they're two separate ones rather. And before PHP 5.4, they're conflated. So if you have that setting off, your site will break whether you're using shortcode version 1 or shortcode version 2 with the equals. You're right, in 5.4, the ini is 1. I mean, it basically comes down to the fact that you're saying, okay, I'm going to use this if you, A, have something less than 5.4, which most people do. Then you could be sending away a theme that might not break someone's site. It looks ugly. I've seen it happen in the wild. It looks ugly. And all for the sake of being lazy and saving a couple characters. So again, this is not I think WordPress probably, you still see some of it, but it used to be rampant in Drupal themes many, many years ago. You don't see it as much anymore. I just bring it up because I did have that debate with a developer I work with, and was so obsessed with it, spent all this time looking into it. Don't do it. Yeah, I should say that I almost didn't call this 10 Commandments of Drupal theming. It's a little bit of a cliche, but I have put a few sort of nuanced, veiled religious references. So this is a saying we say around NPR sometimes. So the WWCD, does everyone know what that means? Yeah, this is just an internal thing. I wish it was more broadly used. What would core do, right? If you have a question about a theme, coding standard, idiom, and you and the guy you're code reviewing with or working with, you can't figure it out. You're like, I don't know, what's the right thing to do? Ask what would core do. However, yeah, it's not ironclad. Oftentimes when we go to core and we look at it and we just say, the ultimate arbiter should just be common sense. Like core, I always thought, before I really dug deep into core, before I started working on this platform at NPR, I always thought it's core. It must be pristine and perfect and invulnerable and amazing. And if they do it this way, there's no other way to do it, and that's the way you should do it. But once you dig into core and start looking at things and looking at issue queues and whatnot, you'll know that that's not true at all. It's pretty good code compared to a random contrib module that you pull off the shelf, but it has issues. And so it's a good sort of general concept to think about. And it's always good to look at core and say, hey, how do they do it in the core? But there are some bad practices. Again, this is just, this is kind of an overstatement. It's just based on my anecdotal evidence. But the core themes are pretty solid. I have not seen a lot of issues in the core themes. Whereas core functionality, especially stuff that doesn't get a lot of attention or is very complicated, you see a lot more sort of strange things going on. 21, you got a bonus one. You got 11 bonus ones, huh? Always be ABA, always be architecting. That's a developer I worked with. He said that the other day. I love it. I still don't know exactly what it means. I kind of do. I'm just going to take it. He might have meant something else. I'm running with it. I love it. There's your Glenn Ross illusion. What do I mean by that? Again, it's probably more relevant to modules, but the more I think about it, it's pretty relevant to themes as well. And it goes back to what I was talking about before, the junk drawers. Thinking in the future. I mean, if you had told me, started working on Core Publisher in 2010, so 28, 29, maybe 2010, if you'd started talking to me about responsive and say, hey, pretty soon you're going to have to write an entire new theme that your content is going to have to move over flawlessly to, and it does all this wacky stuff. I don't even know where to begin with how wacky responsive is. I would have said, and mobile usage is going to be through the roof, and this and that, and you got to prepare for it. No. But that all happened, right? And if I'd known that, I would have made a lot more different decisions when we started writing themes that were had these hard widths and all these bells and whistles and looked good for 2010, but we're having to, I say we again, the team I used to work with is really having to scramble to get things ready for responsive. Just always think about that. Always think about code reuse. Think about your junk drawers. Think about, does this really belong in the theme or does this belong at the module level? All sorts of stuff. Is this piece of functionality so big that it deserves its own module? And the more you think about that, the more sort of broader and abstract, both at the theme level and the module level and your platform or project level, the happier you'll be and the more easier to maintain your code will be. And that really is the end. Any questions?
Earlier on, you talked about Coder. I just wanted to mention the word of advice if you do use Coder to make sure that you double check anything that it does, because I have run into situations where Coder made, made a change that turned out to be incorrect.
Yeah. Does it suggest a change or actually make a change? Yeah. Yeah, that's actually a very good point. There are a bunch of very well, because all Coder is just this huge regex. I've never dared to look underneath the hood, but it's just this huge series of regexes. So there are a bunch of false positives where it thinks it's, it thinks that certain statements are function calls and vice versa. And yeah, that's a really good point. I was going to say there's also, if you're really daring, I forgot where, it's moved around a little bit, but there's another module, basically a companion module to Coder, which will actually make the changes for you, which I've never dared use. I've never dared use on like non-trivial pieces of code. But it's, Coder's awesome. I love Coder. But you're right, there's a series of caveats go with this. The one thing, I'm going to eat my words as soon as I say this, but the one thing I wish it did, again, for someone who is a reluctant documenter, I hate writing doc blocks, but I love them when they're there. When I come back to my code, I'm like, oh, that's what that does. Excellent, now I know. I wish Coder did more. I don't think it does really much at all with doc blocks. And again, it's all one big, I'm sure the patch could be written to help you out there, or help me out. And if there was, if there were any hecklers in the audience, I'm sure that's going to be awesome when you write that. That's a great suggestion. Write that now. Any other questions?
I just want to say I like your presentation. I really appreciate it. But I was asked by one of the organizers to give an announcement.
Yep.
For the networking reception, it's actually happening from 7 to 10, not from 5 to 7 as it listed on your badge. So there's a typo.
Thank you. Anything else? All right, thanks for coming out. I appreciate it.